Every life involves enduring some form of physical or emotional tragedy. Suffering is part of the human condition. Whether it's a birth defect, an accidental injury, or an untimely death, everyone faces tragedy at some point. The major tragedy in my life emerged because of another tragedy, a terrorist attack that hit a small town in the middle of nowhere, a place that could be anywhere. Not a day goes by without thinking of those two tragedies. I'm reminded each time I try to button my collar, throw a ball, or sign my name. I grew up in Sky Gray, Ohio, attending the public schools, playing Little League, exploring the woods, and reading in the library. In those days, parents would send a 7-year-old boy out to play and might not see him for hours. We were more independent before we knew about molesters and kidnappers. We kids would pick up a game of slow-pitch baseball or half-court basketball. We'd form teams of 3 and play fast-pitch baseball with a rubber ball in Jimmy's side yard, running like the Dickens when we broke a window in his house. There were woods nearby where we would explore, sneak around, climb trees, and play army or cowboys. I'd spend whole afternoons playing tennis, knocking a ball against a wall if no one else was around. Or I'd head to the library and read for hours in the air conditioning. I didn't realize how special that time and place were. It was an idol I only recognized many years later. I went to Sky Gray Public High School, getting good enough grades to get into college, and in lieu of anything else or better, I went. My parents paid the way. I liked it. I liked girls, I liked sports, I liked reading, and I liked not having to pay for anything myself. My college years were good years. I dated a few girls, especially Alice, and she stuck with me the last 2 years of undergraduate school. I graduated with good but not great grades and a degree in something that would never pay. I was 22 and the world was opening its arms to me. I just didn't want to be embraced. I knocked around various jobs, proofreading for a company that made how-to books, playing with kids at a daycare center, and unloading furniture at a warehouse. All of these were minimum wage jobs despite my college degree and unconnected to it. Alice dropped out of my life, and neither of us were all that sad about it. I lived at home with my parents, worried about nothing, and only bit by bit did it dawn on me that my life had to change. I joined the Marines, spending a few years as an infantry officer in Virginia and North Carolina. No one shot at me, and our leaders avoided sending me to war or incident, so my service was a series of schools and programs with a short time assigned to a combat unit ready to go to war, which didn't happen for me. Seasickness was my most dangerous foe. In some ways, I had very good luck. Indeed, on one of my leaves, I went home and attended an old friend's wedding. There I found Karen and Prin. She was Karen or Karen and interchangeably, and she liked both. I'd known her in high school, but she was a year younger, and we moved in different circles. At this reception, we gravitated to one another. Perhaps it was my uniform. It definitely was her looks. I didn't think I'd ever talk to her until that night, at least for any length of time. She was just a little shy, about to graduate from college with a teaching license, and things were different with her. We danced and talked and laughed, and I found myself with a girlfriend. I was convinced there had never been a more beautiful, sexy, intelligent, discreet, good person. I didn't think I could find a better woman for loving for life. I had not felt this way about Alice or any other girl. I only saw her 3 times in as many months after the reception, but I was sure. She would kiss me, push that wonderful body against me, and I responded. By the 4th date, I would touch and she would touch me, but we didn't really have much time together or opportunity for more. I was serious though, and I thought she was the one for me. I noticed her pick up a child at a family gathering, talking gently and with humor to him. I saw her give change to a beggar as we walked through downtown Cincinnati. She was perfect, I thought. I was smitten. I flew home any chance I had, or drove overnight on long weekends, and Karen and I became serious as my last year of committed service began. We were engaged in September, as she began her first year teaching at Sky Gray Public Elementary. We decided to get married over Christmas with no fanfare, when I would be home for 2 weeks. Karen contacted the church and kept everything secret. It would be an elopement with no lope. I had duty on Thanksgiving Day, but she made an excuse, flew to Raleigh, and we spent the weekend after Thanksgiving exploring our bodies and having sex in a motel. Her body was wonderful. Karen Ann's face was arresting and even striking in a way that attracted men when they saw her up close. But her body was long, shapely, curved, and drew stares across crowded rooms. She was well-built. 5 weeks later was Christmas, and I had leave until January 3rd. My duties were winding down in the Corps, so I flew home and we were married at the Episcopal Church because it would make our parents happy. Neither of us really held much belief in spirits or God or Jesus. We told them the week before Christmas we had the wedding set up, but we only wanted them and a few friends to attend, and that was how we did it. Christmas was on a Wednesday. We married on Thursday with perhaps 20 people there, and by 7 in the evening we were having sex in a motel in Cincinnati. I still remember that anniversary date. We were together when she said, "I'm pregnant, John," since Thanksgiving. It made for a loving and then almost amazing sexual event. I felt lucky. Karen and was beyond my dreams, sexy and good. I had married the best of women. I won the lottery. We stayed in that motel, ate in its restaurant, and shopped in some shops there, but mainly made love or screwed. It was the same for us, day or night. Even hard sex was loving. But nothing is perfect, and that last day of the year she started to cramp and then bleed, and she said, "John, this shouldn't be happening," and we lost that child then. We spent the day and night at a hospital in the Clifton area of the city, and it was a sad, close moment. The D&C followed. The doctors had no reason to give. "Sometimes these things happen. More than you know," they said, nodding sadly at us. They told us to wait a while and try again. Still, the world was no longer only right. Bad things happened for no reason, and we couldn't avoid all of them. We didn't tell our parents, at least right away. They still pretended our first night together was the day of the wedding, but they really all knew. There was no reason to tell them of the miscarriage since Karen and was okay. It was ours, only ours, I thought. One of those sad secrets that make a marriage stronger. I called the duty officer of my battalion and requested some extra days because of my wife's condition, which was granted after he notified the HO. I was a liaison officer with only routine duties that were easily redistributed. I headed back to Camp Lejeune on the 4th day of the new year. Karen and would wait for me in Sky Gray. We would live with her parents once I left the Marines in July, until we could buy a house or rent an apartment. I was soon reassigned and so spent the last 6 months of my commitment running one of the rifle ranges on base, an assignment often given to a soon-to-depart first lieutenant. As July came to a close, I drove home to a wonderful welcome and stifled sex in my in-laws' home. A few weeks later, I found an acceptable job in a rural growing regional hospital, organizing volunteers and eventually scheduling professional events and educational enrichment for doctors, nurses, and other professionals. Officially, I was the Professional Careers Enhancement Coordinator at the Hospital of Our God's Abode. The hospital was actually incorporated, but they avoided putting ink at the end of the title. The hospital served a very large rural area with no large city, a rare niche that it filled well. It was growing rapidly as the communities nearby came to rely on it. I would help professionals maintain their certificates and licenses or upgrade when possible. Eventually, as I learned the demands, I'd coordinate with medical colleges and other hospitals when a doctor asked for help. I worked with schools and programs to organize lectures for new or advancing professionals, especially for some of our more prominent doctors. God's Abode lacked a standard personnel department that other larger hospitals had. It needed one, according to some department heads, and I hoped my position would grow if it were organized. We found a small house in town, only 2 bedrooms, but there was a small utility room that could be converted to a small 3rd bedroom. We would be in one and any kid who came along could be in the other until we could convert the back room or afford a bigger place. It had 1 bath, a small laundry room, and no basement. The backyard was small, but large enough to toss baseballs. So what else was the purpose of a backyard? Actually, there was a small patio with an oak shade tree. There was a dying ash tree over to one side. Magnificent at one time, but now dying from borers. I think Karen was disappointed in the house we could afford, but it was that or an apartment. We closed on September 20th with immediate occupancy. So we were only with her parents for 2 months or so, and happily, that had not been onerous. The day after I was hired, there was a reception for all the new hires, doctors, and administrators, as well as some sort of hospital benefit. Karen and I attended, meeting this nurse and that doctor and the main administrators. I was introduced to the staff, along with others. Karen was fetching in a gray dress that was a little too sexy, showing a bit much of her cleavage for a Catholic hospital, but she enjoyed the attention of doctors and others she seemed to attract. I didn't say men because one woman was definitely hoping she was in the game. Karen was demure in behavior, if not attire, and I was proud to be her husband. She enjoyed the evening. I have regretted not paying more attention to Karen at that gathering. We were pregnant with Dylan by the beginning of October, and we discovered it in November. As the pregnancy progressed that month, Karen complained that her back was hurting, so we bought a firmer mattress that she said helped. Karen said she had names ready for our first child, Dylan for a boy and Hanley if a girl. Dylan was born in June, happy, healthy, and long. He was bright-eyed, moved a lot, and soon smiled. I think he was happy from birth. I played with that kid every moment, and Karen enjoyed watching us play on a blanket on the floor. Dylan was a wonderful joy. Dylan. In December, with Dylan now 7 months old, Karen and said she was pregnant again. But like our first pregnancy, this child was doomed. Christmas with Dylan was wonderful as he started crawling, and the positive prospect of another in August was warming. But for some reason, we lost this one in January when the cramping started. Karen and called for me to hold her. We called my parents to take Dylan, and I took my poor wife to the hospital for another D&C. This time it was my hospital. I never left her side. Again, the doctors shook their heads at our bad luck. There was nothing to do. They said, 2 miscarriages were not that unusual, and you have 1 healthy child. If it happens again, we'll do some tests, take some time, heal and gain strength. We did, and our patience was rewarded. I was convinced of the strength of our marriage, and never more convinced than after the 2 miscarriages. I held Karen, kissed her as she wept, more at the loss of expected happiness than the pain itself. The great tragedy of our miscarriages was the loss of a joyous dream. After our first, Karen had clung to me, literally and emotionally. My arm would be gripped in public. Her body would push into mine as we walked on the sidewalk or in a mall. After the second, she accepted my condolence, but her eyes looked distant at times, as if she needed to speak but didn't want to say it. It was as if she were looking for something that was not there. I wondered if the pain of miscarriage diminished her desire for children. I assumed it had to do with the wear and tear of work and pregnancies, dual miscarriages, and raising a child. By August, we were pregnant again and knew it a month later, and this one was our Hanley, the little girl we prayed to have. She was dark-haired and chubby and again a taller child, wonderful to tease and cuddle. She was born April 1st. Her older brother wondered at this sudden increase, toddling about and trying to talk and suddenly competing for attention and hugs. As every parent knows, work goes on despite midnight cryings and 3 o'clock feedings, and we were exhausted many days dressing for work. I was accustomed to my job and did it well, I thought, and father seemed pleased. But Karen was slowly running down after she went back to teach in May, so we decided to have no more children for a bit. We had our hands full, breastfeeding the one and gradually teaching Dylan to take only 1 step at a time. The house was suddenly full, and we needed to decide what to do. We kept Hanley with us in a bassinet, and Dylan had a room to himself, so close I could hear him turn over in bed on a quiet night. Not many were quiet. Hanley needed feeding, or wanted to wiggle at 3:15 a.m., or wanted to see if we'd get up for her. Usually we were cheerful, or at least we faked it. We watched an old Humphrey Bogart movie after one wake up that denied further sleep. Karen and I cuddled in front of the TV, watching a plane in Casablanca take off in heavy fog. I thought it a touching, weary moment. I felt loved and valued, and Karen snuggled. Perhaps we needed more such nights. We were still young, and young families are cramped as they save for that bigger house or prepare for that better job, so I didn't fret. It was the way of life, youthful struggle and middle-aged success. There was reason to believe our situation would improve. God's abode was a good place to work, but my job was a hodgepodge of duties that frequently went unnoticed by more than 1 or 2 doctors or nurses. Father stopped in to talk with me shortly after Hanley was born, to ask my plans and what I wanted out of working at God's abode. I explained that I saw the job as a dead end for me unless there was an increase in responsibility, and he nodded. I could make more money selling suits in a mall. I said that with 2 kids, I had more need of a career and needed to be more ambitious. He nodded again and said he was thinking along those lines too. Once he left, I wondered if he was hinting I should leave. Hanley was just over a month old. Dylan would turn 2 in a few months. My wife had lovingly borne 2 children, suffered 2 miscarriages, and quietly accepted my easy contentment with our life. For me, life was a lot of joy. I had just the normal insecurities of a man in his late 20s. It all went away with the massacre, not because of it, but because it never was. It was always a chimera, in several senses of the word. I had been at our God's abode for 2 years and 9 months on the awful morning that made us famous. The God's abode shooting occurred at my hospital on June 3rd, early in the morning. You may have heard of it. Some people call it a massacre, a terrorist attack. By any term, a lot of people died. It was a sunny day, not too hot, and I was checking on a lecture I'd scheduled for beginning surgeons in Classroom 2 at 8:30 a.m. and a demonstration dissection of cancerous liver tissue in Classroom 1A at 8:45. My watch said 8:28. I walked to 2, which was on my end of the hallway, where there were people milling about just as shots sounded behind me. If you have not heard M16 fire, it is not particularly booming, but it is penetrating and arrests your attention, especially indoors. It is more of a sharp cracking sound if it is fired in rhythmic, short patterns, and that was what I heard coming from the main entrance behind me. It was so much louder than I remembered from the shooting range. Everyone first thought it must be firecrackers, but somehow I knew it was not. It went on. a cadenced series of pops. It turned out they had plenty of targets. There were young doctors standing about the hall near the doorway to 2, and they looked startled, wondering what the sound could be. I said, "That's gunfire. Get in the room, in the room." They looked as if they didn't believe me, and I had to push them to get them moving. "You can get out the rear window if it's safe. Look first. I'm gonna lock the door here. Pile up some stuff in front of the door if you have to." I heard, "Oh my God, and what is this?" And then they moved. "I'm locking the door now, be careful," I said. As one little woman doctor stared at me. I closed the door and locked it. There were a lot of pops. I turned back to the hall. There was the popping sound in little groups of 3. Pop, pop, pop. Pop, pop, pop. Not automatic, but 3 rounds as fast as the finger could comfortably move the trigger, and repeated. It was disciplined, cadenced. As it went on, it became paired shots. They were in a target-rich environment and didn't need to use so much ammunition. Disciplined killers were usually trained somewhere, I thought. I moved carefully beyond my little office. I heard shooting and screaming. Then I heard some shots, probably from a security guard because they were lower and deeper. There were 3 or 4 of these and the pistol shots stopped. A moment later, I peeked around the bend in the hall and saw a security guard on the floor in a pool of his blood. He was behind a counter that had holes through it, and I assumed he'd been shot while ducking behind. I still didn't see the shooter or shooters. There were screams and voices, and it was disconcerting. Farther down the hall, I could see several bodies on the floor, none moving. Pop, 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 pop. As I got closer, the sound was more like a cracks piercing my eardrums. I moved to the guard, crouched, felt his neck, but he was gone. "Ah, Tommy," I exhaled audibly. I took the semi-automatic pistol from his hand and found 2 loaded magazines in a holder on his belt. I released the magazine in his 9mm pistol. The magazine fell from the butt, and I saw that it held 11 rounds, so I replaced it with a full magazine, 15 rounds loaded, and put the 11 and other full magazine in my pocket. I checked the breech, and there was a round ready to go. I heard shooting down the main hall, near the elevators. Pop, 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 pop. I heard a thump and a groan, like someone let the air out of his lungs loudly, and I was at the hall intersection to the main elevators. There were 2 bodies behind the information center counter here, which I now ducked in front of. Mrs. Sissom and a guy I didn't know from the business office. Jody Sissom was still alive. She seemed to be quietly sobbing. "Jody, it's John. I'm going down the hall. How many did you see?" "How many, Jody?" "One I saw, but I heard someone else shooting." "Am I going to die?" she said. I was crouched on the other side of the counter and really couldn't see her since I'd put it between me and the main hall. "God, I hope not," I said. "Hang in there, Jody. Hold pressure on it. I'm going down the hall, so hopefully you won't see any more of them. I think I'm behind them. Good luck." I saw body after body as I made my way down the hallway, my back to the left side wall as much as possible. I passed the elevators. I saw empty 30-round magazines, taped to one another upside down and discarded on the floor. "Oh, my God," I thought, 60 rounds from one gun already? I stepped over a guy I'd never seen, walked by an orderly with a head wound, his eyes open and unseeing. I walked past the cardiology waiting room where there were people on the floor. If anyone can move, the hall is clear behind me, just head straight out the main entrance. I saw a man and a woman get up, move carefully and then break for the doors 40 feet behind me. For people didn't move, they just lay there. That made 10, I thought. Blood was everywhere. I passed the waiting room. I heard more shooting ahead near the cardiology operating rooms on the right and the glass back door to the cafeteria on the left. This shooting also sounded like a gun battle. I scooted down the empty hall, scared. I thought, you have 2 children and a wife, and this is not in your job description. The door to the cafeteria was ajar. I saw them there, their backs to me. They were 2 dark-haired men in camouflage, and they shot many morning breakfasters in the cafeteria. Apparently, the people there had not noticed or recognized the shootings in the entry and hall, and the killers had burst into the cafeteria behind their coffee line. There must have been 10 or 12 people on the floor, all apparently dead. Others were cowering, alive but playing a possum, or just afraid they were next. The shooting had now stopped because the situation had changed. The killers were 5 feet from me. They were looking across the cafeteria at 2 security guards who had their pistols aimed back at them. The guards were behind the pillars near the dead in the coffee line. They didn't want to fire because hostages were involved. The killers were only 5 feet apart. I noticed one AR-15 type rifle on the floor by the killer on my left. He had his left arm around a woman's neck and a pistol pointed at her head with his right. The other guy had his rifle pointing toward the guards with one hand. And he also had some poor 15-year-old boy around the neck. They were a good step forward of the first pair, from my angle. They were using hostages as shields. I looked through the open doorway. I knew the guards could see me behind the killers, and I recognized the one guard. I pointed at the guy with the pistol and signaled 1 to the guards. I pointed at the guy with the rifle and signaled 2. I then pointed at myself and mimicked shooting first the guy on the left and then the guy on the right. I transferred the pistol to my left hand. I rehearsed the moves in my head for a second, thought of something Captain Malarkey had taught us at the basic school. This should be a moment of maximum aggression. Then I took a deep breath. It was quick. I took 2 forceful steps straight into the cafeteria and left, behind the one guy. Knocked the pistol up from the woman's head with my right hand and with my left hand. Fired my pistol from about 2 inches away into the left side of the guy's head, trying to angle the gun enough to the right so the bullet would miss the woman and her son, farther away, should it go straight through, which it did. The pistol recoil was more than I expected. I'd never fired with my left hand alone, and it was at an odd angle. I felt a stinging pain in my right hand, which was flung right, but I concentrated on moving to the other guy. Time slowed down. The remaining terrorist turned his head toward me, obviously startled. I roared a guttural sound, pivoted on my right foot, took a big step with my left foot straight toward the guy as I extended my left arm and put the pistol into his face. He made a grimace and I put a round from 5 inches away through his left cheekbone, just below his left eye and out the back of his head. He didn't have time to move his rifle enough to aim at anyone. He joined his fellow terrorist on the tile floor. I held my pistol on him, angry and willing to fire again if he moved. I have never regretted those shots. After a long moment of silence, there were screams and moans and cries. The woman on the left wailed and turned to the boy who cried out, his ears probably ringing from the report of the pistol so close. But neither of them were shot and the killers were down. I kept my pistol pointing at those 2 on the floor, angry and projecting all the rage I could generate. But they were definitely dead. Kicking their rifles and pistol away anyway, I leaned over them and said, "You messed with the wrong Marine." My right hand was mangled. The bullet that killed the first guy came out his right cheek and hit my hand as I pushed his weapon up from the woman's head. At that point, the guards were there, and they said something about me being okay, and there seemed to be a fog. I asked, "Were there only 2? Bill Meyer," the one guard said. "Yeah, pretty sure. Others are checking." "You okay, Mr. Buck?" I took a deep breath and lost my aggression. It drained from me, and a wave of weakness passed through. Hurt my hand. The lady and boy were in each other's arms. I guess they were mother and son. "You two okay, ma'am?" I asked. They were crying and clinging to each other on the near benches. Thank God, she said, tears streaming, nodding at me, holding her son's head to her chest. "I need to sit, Bill," I said. My left hand was shaking with the weapon now. I handed him the pistol. I took it off Tommy out front. He was? "I know, John, I know." "Jody was hurt. Someone should see to her," I said. My hand was up, blood running to my elbow and dripping. "I'm making a mess." The world seemed slow. I sat beside the crying lady and her son on one of the table bench seats, resting my right elbow and holding my hand up, but it still puddled blood on the table. My left hand gripped my wrist, trying to stop the blood and pain. Suddenly, there were policemen everywhere. I looked at my watch on my left wrist. 8:43. It had taken only 15 minutes. It was almost time for that liver dissection. There were many dead and as many wounded. Hospital personnel were everywhere wrapping wounds, calling for gurneys, attempting resuscitation. Father Michaels was there, just a priest this morning, performing last rites, getting attention for those who needed it, praying. He looked over at me holding my hand up, nodded, and went about his business. The police came for the mother and son beside me. I was in my adrenaline come-down fog, shaking, and I felt a hand on my left shoulder. I looked up at the woman, her son still in her grasp, and she was crying. She squeezed my shoulder. She tried to say, "Thank you," but no sound came out. I smiled and nodded back. A policeman appeared with rolls of gauze and started to wrap my hand as he asked what I saw and did. I told him I killed the guys and he stopped, looked me in the eyes and said, "Good. You might not want to talk about it, but to us cops." He disappeared to talk to others, then. Rolls of gauze were everywhere. I rewrapped my own bandage when that one soaked through. My injuries was not terribly important this day. They eventually put me in a room and left me, since a guy who shoots himself in the hand should be protected from humiliation. An orderly bandaged my right hand again sometime later to control the dripping, but otherwise, I was a low priority considering the carnage around the building. I decided to let Karen know I was okay. I had trouble getting the phone out of my right side pocket, but I managed after a few attempts. I guess the cell lines in the area were overloaded because there was no way to get a message through. I kept trying every few minutes. About 10:30 I finally reached the school. The school secretary then sent the call through even though Karen Ann was in class. The God's Abode hospital shooting was all over the news media and word had reached everyone in Little Sky Gray, Ohio. Karen, and, hey, yeah, I'm fine, well, gonna be fine. You heard of the killing? Awful. Yeah, I saw some. Karen Ann, be calm now. I got shot in the hand, babe. Yeah, not too bad. No, I did. Me. I shot myself by accident. Anyway, they'll operate on it in the next few days probably, but not like the others. Awful, babe. No, I don't know if any doctors were shot. Calm down. I'm okay. I'll find out more about who was hurt soon. I'm sure. Yeah, thank God. I'll probably stay here overnight. Come see me after school. Good. Disorganized here right now. Cops everywhere. Love you too. She'd seemed frantic, even panicked about finding out everyone who was hurt, to see if she knew any. I assumed there'd be a lot of sadness in Sky Gray this day. I called my mom, who sounded fretful and teary. I asked her to put Dad on. I explained everything to him. I didn't tell him I shot the guys. I decided it would be best if I told the police and no one else. My mom asked for constant updates on my hand, but I just laughed and said if there was any news I'd call. I lay back and thought about things. It was weird that in the midst of this carnage, with strange policemen and government officials everywhere, I was alone for long periods. I had time to think. I think climactic events motivate introspection. I thought about Karen Ann. In our conversation, something had seemed awkward, as if she had something she wanted to say, fraught with urgency, but that she couldn't bring herself to voice. It was gravid, which I had not expected. I had expected extreme concern, focused on my injuries, and matter-of-fact attitude about arranging for a substitute teacher and things like that. She had quickly dismissed my injuries and moved on to other things, which, considering the nature of my injuries compared to others, was reasonable to me. I had expected to relieve her anxiety, yet it continued unabated. We had changed in the last years, since we married and I returned from the Marines. Since we moved to the little house, since she became pregnant with Dylan, her ardor was diminished. More than that, we had not talked, not cuddled, not made time for each other very much. I remembered the one time we cuddled in the middle of the night. It was the rarest moment. We still had sex, but it was more routine, despite any act I prepared or performed. She no longer liked romantic talk or moments, dates, insinuations of sex to come, or anything like that. I wondered if it was me. We were just settling into normal married life. I missed the enthusiasm of our early sex life. I missed young sex. I missed that sense of warmth that we had before the children. I shook my head. Missed it. Karen had found someone to cover her last classes and made it to the hospital by 1:30. I was in a hospital gown by this time, but I had no restriction or drip or anything yet. Painkillers were being administered by injection or orally, when needed. The hospital was very busy with the ongoing tragedy of the dead and injured. Doctors were operating in all the surgeries. I later discovered that we sent many to Dayton and Cincinnati hospitals if they could travel and needed an operation. Karen came speedily across the room and hugged me as I sat on the bed, my bandaged hand in the air. I thought it looked like a giant cotton swab with the thick gauze enclosing it. It was all too much emotionally for her. Tears came. Who was killed? Do you know? They aren't releasing names yet, she said. She looked around my hand to see me. I said, I only know one or two for sure by name. No one we ever socialized with. I saw the bodies of some I didn't know, some visitors or patients. There were a bunch. Blood everywhere. She wiped at her eyes. I saw blood on the floor, bullet holes, and police tape. Father Michaels put me on the elevator. They weren't going to let me in, she said, shaking her head, resting her hand on my shoulder. Looking off a bit, she went on. On the radio, they just said they have no motive and they can't name the guys yet. They said neither man had any identification and no one seemed to know who they were. Everyone assumes they were religious extremists. It's so strange. I mean, why here? We don't have a building over 4 stories except for the hospital, she said. We're nobody. She asked, so can you tell me what happened? To you? Yeah. Mostly I came across dead or dying people. I decided that I would give her the same version of events that I'd give everyone except for the police. I'd tell her the details when she was settled and calm. She was obviously upset. eyes puffy, and the panic in her voice on the phone had been surprising. I'd never thought of her as the panicky type. Some things I would pretermit. I heard shooting down the hall, and I got some new doctors to leave through the window of the classroom. Then I sort of followed the killers down the halls to the cafeteria, where I finally saw them. I had a pistol I took from a guard who was down, and the first time I fired it, I shot my own hand. There were security guys there, and the bad guys were killed. Did I protect myself by pointing to the buffoonish aspect of the incident? Was I avoiding her? Hurt like hell, babe. There was a mother and her 15-year-old kid the killers were using as hostages. They survived but got quite a scare. Then the police showed up. Karen and was incredulous and syrupy, a bit mocking, disdainful. I'd never heard that from her. I think you were brave, even if you can't shoot. All that Marine stuff was just too long ago, I guess, she said. It was as if she were pushing all thought aside where I was concerned. She pushed aside all faith in me. She didn't wonder that I'd shot my right hand, despite my being right-handed. I loved Karen, and since the time I saw her at that wedding, she'd been calm for both miscarriages and faced the operations with strength. I'd been there every sufferance. She was different in this. I didn't understand her attitude or the upset in her eyes. I realized suddenly and clearly that my wife had no respect for me. Perhaps because of leaving the Marines, the disappointment of our small house, my willingness to accept a minor position for work, and the other disappointments of our lives together, she had lost any conception that I was competent and did some good. She thought her husband inept and less than common, and she skillfully categorized information to support that as a prejudice. Your low-key humble trappings demeanor was paying unwanted dividends, John, I thought wryly. In an age of self-promotion, you project modesty. Even your wife thinks you're inept. Knucklehead. You're adult. There was a knock on the frame of the open door. John Buck? There was a woman at the door, holding up a badge. I'm with the police. I need to interview you about what happened. She walked in. Of course, officer. My wife, Karen, and I said, Karen, and said, I'll get out of here. I'll be back after I take care of the kids. She left immediately. It was a quick exit, as if she had no interest in these proceedings, and a large one elsewhere. The kids, I was sure. The detective said, sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt anything. I shook my head. I knew how it looked and I wondered. I recounted my story in as much detail as I could. She asked questions. I had not seen the killers before. No, I had not seen a third shooter. Yes, I knew how to use a pistol. I'd worked at the pistol range occasionally during my last year in the Marines. No, I'd never fired left-handed. The range was short. She looked at me and nodded. Mr. Buck, I just want to say, have you no idea what you did? I didn't smile. I remembered the gore as I aimed a pistol at two guys on the floor. I killed two bad guys. She shook her head. She said they had not released the identities of the two, and that my actions were being discussed in the news, although my name had not become known yet. I thought back. The only people who had seen me clearly were the two security guys and the two hostages after I acted, the woman and her son. Everyone else was down, hiding behind tables and chairs, trying to get out of the line of fire. Perhaps someone had hazarded a look, but I'd quickly turned to sit on the bench and protect my hand after I kicked the weapons away. Perhaps only a few knew. The detective said I should avoid telling people. If these were terrorists, the less information in their hands, the better. Karen and came back in tears 2 hours later. I assumed it was the wanton butchery upsetting her, the scope of the disaster being overwhelming for anyone. She just shook her head and said it was horrible, occasionally crying. Casualty lists were emerging as next of kin were notified and area hospitals identified patients. She sat by my side until I was sent to X-ray, and she was there as the hand doctor explained the operation I would need in the morning. Karen and stayed until 9 that evening, and then went home to get things ready for tomorrow. She intended to be back for the operation on my hand and had taken the day off. Indeed, the school district was considering closing schools because so many families were affected, one way or another, and the end of the school year was only a few days away. The attack was all over the news. A comprehensive list of casualties came out about midnight. Dead were 9 hospital employees. Thomason, the guard whose pistol I had used, his good care of his weapon had ended the murders. One administrator who I knew well, Curtis Wills, the hospital's chief accountant, several with whom I had a passing acquaintance, 2 doctors, one who had been honored for a heart valve operation he'd pioneered. Jody still lived, but there were more deaths. 12 visitors were killed out front in the waiting area and in the cafeteria. Other casualties were legion. 37 people were treated in various hospitals in critical to good conditions. I was listed as fair. Mrs. Spagnol and her son Tony were alive after their hostage experience. but only because the security guards confronted the gunman. No one knew a motive, or at least no one thought it was anything other than religious extremism visiting small-town America. Perhaps that was the point. It was 4 in the morning when I awoke, disoriented. I was in a hospital room, Karen, and was home with the kids. My hand throbbed. They planned to operate on it in a few hours. I stared up at the ceiling. I remembered the bodies. I thought of Karen Ann's concern, her almost abrupt visits, her odd weeping. Something was going on. My mind leapt to conclusions which I discarded as silly. Karen Ann called about 5:30 a.m. to say she would be there after the operation. She needed to get the kids to her parents and write lesson plans for school. She was sorry she couldn't be there before the operation. My hand was repaired as well as it could be by Dr. Tara Beatole, who was the hand doctor for our part of the world. She operated at 7 a.m., her first of the day. My grip would probably never recover good strength, but I would have one. All my fingers would work, and I would feel and could even lift as long as that grip threshold was not reached. I could throw a ball, but my release might be difficult or make me wild. My jar-opening days were likely ended. People would notice a weak handshake. I was just a little crippled, and it would not be obvious. She worked on my hand for 5 hours, a long time for a hand, I think. I was put into one of those euphoric, almost awake states that regular people call sleep. After the operation, I imagined seeing Karen Ann by my side, and she was, but so was a scruffy guy who looked like he needed sleep. I was foggy for a while, so the guy stayed in the background until I asked who he was. Karen Ann said, "I don't really know. He has a badge." He stepped forward. "Mr. Buck, I'm Special Agent Remark. I'm with Homeland Security." He paused, letting me think about that. "Mrs. Buck, you should hear this. After yesterday, we believe that you and your family may be in some danger of retaliation by the group that attacked the hospital." Karen Ann's eyes showed surprise. "Why us?" she asked. "Because of your husband's actions yesterday," Remark said, looking at her as if she were not quite lucid. "For shooting himself in the hand?" she asked, incredulous, laughing. It sounded like sniggering to me. The agent looked from her to me, and he saw the expressions on our faces. I shook my head the tiniest bit. The agent saw it and looked at Karen Ann. She concealed what confidence she had in me, which I now realized was very little. Her disdain was practically adolescent. I thought she appeared arrogant. Of all her quirks, of all her attributes, I'd never recognized arrogance in her. Remark, seeing the marital dynamic and probably wondering at it, decided not to volunteer details. He was a professional at walking into situations with incomplete knowledge. No, just for being involved at all. We think we can contain the story to some degree, which should afford everyone involved some protection. The guards, the hostages, the witnesses, and he hesitated just a split second to peek at me. The guy who killed the terrorists. We've confiscated the videos from the 2 surveillance cameras in the cafeteria, and the ones in the hall don't show much. There's a cell phone video playing on YouTube from one of the people in the cafeteria, and it shows the takedown, but you can't see who it was. It's just too fuzzy and the light was not great. The voice is unclear, he said. "Mr. Buck, we'd like your cooperation in keeping everyone's name quiet." Perhaps Karen Ann assumed I was a witness. I'd given her that impression. I hesitated to think. I knew the guards, Jody, the Spagnolls. That should be no problem for me. The guards? They want to keep it quiet. We're also keeping their names out of the news. The 2 hostages, also. Everyone knows what happened, but not who did what. We'd like everyone to keep the names out of the story. The guards will just say it was someone they didn't know. A visitor, probably. Hopefully, everyone will be protected. No one should give anyone's name. "You saw what happened?" Karen Ann asked me, surprised I'd been that close, I guess. In the whole affair, that was as close as she came to being impressed with me, or respectful. Perhaps it was my fault for not being upfront about it. "Yeah, I saw it." "You could say that." "Then I shot my hand and I got real nauseous and the police were everywhere," I said. I'd not realized her loss of regard. I trusted Karen Ann with everything. Even though I joked about my foibles and actions, I thought she had a higher opinion of me. It's a part of the marriage commitment, to love and honor. What does honoring your spouse mean? Didn't she see humility as a virtue? She likely did, in theory. She simply didn't recognize humility in me. Humility required a level of competence she didn't consider mine. I was disappointed in her. I wondered what had happened to us, and when. How. "I'll be back in a bit, Mr. Buck," Special Agent Remark said, "and we'll need to get into some greater detail." "Anytime, sir. I'll be here all day today and tomorrow until noon. At least, it's what the doc said. After that, I'll be home a few days. You must have my address?" He nodded and left. Karen and put her head on my shoulder. Awkward though that was. "Glad you're okay," she said. "Me too," I said. "Did you see who killed them?" she asked. "I didn't see much of him," I said, considering that truthful if misleading. "I'll not tell anyone anything." I resolved to make an effort to talk more with her, to ask her opinions, to give mine and accept disagreement. I wanted to diminish the strange distance between us. I wanted Karen and to love me as much as I loved her. My good arm was around her. Her head was on my chest, and I kissed her hair. For some time, the arrogance of some of the best doctors at our hospital had rankled me. One surgeon made a small mistake during a liver transplant by accidentally slicing a drain tube and had to replace it for the operation to continue. The mistake was no big deal. The operation went without a hitch, really, and the patient was doing well, but I watched as he called the family together to give them the legal rundown on the procedure. Still in his scrubs, straight from the operating room, he went over and poured himself some burned bad coffee from the pot in the waiting room, then sat down with the family, leaning back like one of the guys. I noticed he held the cup of coffee to his lips occasionally, but did not really sip any. At the end of describing the successful operation, he said, "Oh, one little thing." And then he described the slight mistake as the law required. Cheek, I thought. He knew their only concern was the condition of their loved one. This guy sold an exhausting operation like a referee with a bad call or a car salesman with a slightly beat up but decent car. It would bother me. Legally, doctors must admit their humanity, admit their mistakes, and most do, most of the time, but listen for them carefully. They're just people. I came to a different conclusion as I had more experience with doctors. One of our doctors failed to save a woman with an aortic aneurysm, and he trashed the operating room, throwing trays of instruments and breaking a light, scaring the other doctor and the nurses around him. He was arrogant and angry, and I reflectively thought, damn, I would want him fighting for me, willing to do whatever it took to save my kid, or my wife, or my mom, and taking it personally if he couldn't. If he didn't believe the procedure should work at least this once, who would? Arrogance was a small price to pay for knowledge, judgment, skill, and determination, all wrapped up in a human being. Personal characteristics aside, doctors dealt with us in our worst moments of life. Perhaps in order to inspire confidence, arrogance was projected as a form of confidence. It was not all of the doctors, but it was not rare. Some were more self-actualized, confident, joking, and sincere, looking into a patient's eyes as if every word was significant and revealing, or into the face of a husband whose wife was in dire condition and who deserved one moment of understanding from the person most likely to help, if anyone could. Often arrogance was just arrogance, building up the confidence of doctor, patient, and family when confidence was most needed. Of course, that doesn't make them easy to like. I don't blame the arrogant, nor do I seek their company. Sean Dunstan was an arrogant one. Many a nurse, many another doctor, had been openly chastised for a mistake or difference of opinion during the middle of an operation, even in the operating room with the patient laid open before them. He just thinks he's God, I heard an exasperated nurse say once. Likability was beside the point, though. Dunstan was a very good doctor, considered by One magazine, which rates doctors like football teams, the best cardiologist in this part of the country. He invented a procedure that vastly improved the likely survivability of heart transplant recipients and wrote a paper on procedures to help heart valve replacement. The hospital was proud that he was here. Since his paper was published 10 months before the shootings, he was requested for consultation or speaking engagements in hospitals around the country: Johns Hopkins, Mayo Clinic, Cleveland Clinic, UCLA. Why would a guy like that stay at a country hospital like God's abode? Indeed, I had heard that the board expected him to resign at the end of his contract, once he decided whether he wanted to live in New York, Los Angeles, or any one of the other places that good doctors go to become richer and more famous. He had a great future until he was shot through his heart walking into our cafeteria. He was relatively young, 40, and handsome, dark and tall, and probably played tennis well. He chose the wrong moment to get that coffee or sweet roll, and he took a 5.56 round in the front and out the back, obliterating most of the muscle that beats, the same one he knew how to exchange for another. I hardly knew him, but occasionally we'd pass in the hall. I'd met him at 2 parties over the 3 years I'd been here. He'd acknowledge my greetings with a wave of his hand and looking past me, pointing out my inconsequence to him. He was known to have attracted quite a bit of money in the form of donations, having founded and led the heart transplant team the last 4 years and gaining a reputation for helping some very sick people. Regional, largely rural hospitals rarely conducted heart transplants, rarely obtained the required licenses and certification. Ours was one of those few. I admitted to telling people I knew him. Sometimes, He was the only reason people in other places had heard of our God's Abode Hospital or Skygray, Ohio. I went home on Friday, 2 days after the shooting, but I was practically couch-ridden with my hand up in a contraption for a few days. I would sleep on the couch due to the strange contraption. I liked seeing the kids, Hanley still immobile and Dylan toddling about and trying to speak words. Karen and took them to her parents and occasionally mine. So they were taken care of and I wouldn't have to do anything, awkward as I was those days. She had a lot to do that weekend, and with work Monday and Tuesday, since the last days of school with the students had been canceled. She was on the phone in the other room a lot Saturday. Anyway, I spent most of my time at home, figuring how to use a bathroom with a hand on a wheeled holder-upper, learning to use a remote control left-handed. I watched the news, saw the shadowy recording of my actions. Anyone who looked carefully could see that the shooter had shot his own hand. They heard the yell as I shot the second guy, and my statement standing over them was clear, the only clear thing on the whole recording, but it didn't sound like my voice. I doubted anyone could identify the voice as mine, perhaps Karen or my dad. Dad might recognize how I carried myself. In any case, I was lauded anonymously on Fox, one guy calling me a hero and another on MSNBC an unknown deliverer. I shook my head. It did identify the shooter as a Marine. I expected to be identified, but was not. Karen was in and out Sunday, shopping for groceries and even visiting the mall for clothes for me. Shirts I could get over my hugely bandaged hand and without buttons, etc. She went to Walmart around midnight to be sure the family had what it needed for a few days. I didn't see that there was need for such a rush. The community was coming to grips with the tragedy. Funerals began on Saturday, and most were scheduled in the coming week. One notable one was Monday. Wills, the accountant, whom I counted a friend. I didn't go, unwilling to drive with so many painkillers in my system. One of the dead terrorists had a brother, it later turned out. I imagined him begging his brother to accompany them, but his brother refusing him. I visualized their parting. It is not your mission. You are not trained. You have another destiny, perhaps his brother's last words to him as he left for Ohio. Yusef hugging him briefly with a hand behind his neck. I imagined him on that day of the massacre, as my hand throbbed in the night, first getting the news that his brother was dead, having killed so few despite the expectations. It was supposed to be glorious, backcountry Americans facing trained warriors. Yusef would not be the great martyr he'd promised to be. Perhaps he mourned his brother's failure in the great moment of his life. Shot in the head by an off-handed infidel. Yusef was gone now, so cheaply. Not a failure, but not what they had hoped. In a town just east of Indianapolis, facing east on his knees, he may have had tears streaming down his face at his loss. Karen still had school. The last 2 days of the teacher schedule were that Monday and Tuesday. I asked her, "What do you do at school on the last days without students?" And she said she had books to count, posters to take down, walls to clean, recommendations to write, grades to check, meetings to attend. You know, she was obviously tired, having gotten only 5 or 6 hours of rest after all her shopping and work yesterday. She kissed me goodbye Monday morning and left about 6:30, wearing blue jeans and a work shirt, saying she'd be home at the usual time. She took the kids to her mom's house across town, where they could spend the day and I wouldn't have to care for them. It was about 10:15 a.m. that Terry Marks called, asking for Karen and, as the teaching team leader, Terry had to verify that each teacher had entered an accurate grade and Karen Ann's grade for one student was not consonant with the average she'd earned for the quarter. This happened when a teacher decided a student deserved a higher grade than the average in the computer. Never did teachers enter a final letter grade below the percentage indicated. She said she had a question about the grade Karen and wanted to give a kid. Karen Ann's not here. She should be there with you guys. She left here around the usual time, I said. Oh, I thought she stayed home to take care of you, Terry said. Took a sick day. No, not here. If she's not there, I don't know where she is. It's probably my mistake, Terry said, as if something was dawning on her. I could hear an almost desperate quality in her voice, like she'd committed a faux pas of some sort. I didn't understand. She's probably in another part of the building. I just haven't seen her up here, but all her stuff's in, so there's no reason she'd need to be up here. I thought about that a minute. Well, I can't help you, Terry. I'll let her know you're looking for her when I see her. Thanks, John. Hope the hand feels better. Thanks. Bye. I hung up. Terry's mistake was calling on our landline instead of Karen Ann's cell phone. It was about 12:30 p.m. Karen and called to see how I was. John, how's home? She said. Fine, babe. How's school? Oh, you know, so much to do to close up the room and things. Too many books. All have to be counted and stacked and discrepancies noted. It gets tiresome after 5 hours, working mostly alone in the room. I have a lot of stuff to pack this year. Why don't you pick me up and I'll keep you company? Nah, I'm going to go out with some of the other teachers, she said. Get some lunch. You take it easy. I'll see you around 4:30. Okay. Fine, Karen Ann. See you then. Love you, I said. Me too, John. Bye. Me too. Father Michaels called that afternoon. John, this is Mike. I know what you did, John. I spoke to the security guards before the police even got them, but we're doing everything we can to contain it. It's probably best your name not be out there for the extremists. Thank you, sir. I hope to be back at work next week or so. Take your time and heal. Things won't be normal here for a while. It's pretty awful. There are lots of Homeland Security investigators around, lots of police from various agencies, some in full battle dress. I could imagine him shaking his head. Okay, well, one of the investigators is supposed to come by tomorrow, I said. My hand is pretty useless and the bulky wrap is tough to get around. I'll be in contact. I have funerals all week, insurance issues, but I should be able to contact you. Get better, come in and see me if I'm around, and we'll talk about some ideas I have. I'd like to change your job a little, or a lot. Yes, sir. Thanks for calling. So he was thinking about changing my job? Father knew what he was doing. He was purposely increasing my anxiety level, making me want to get back to work, to see if I had a job. That didn't sound like the administrator I'd known for 3 years. No, he wanted me eager to get to work for its sake. I wondered what ideas he had. Karen Ann and the kids arrived about 5, Dylan running, with a huge wet diaper between his legs, to me, and Hanley in her arms. Tonight, I just want to take it easy and watch you play with the kids, she said, smiling. I'll second that. I don't have to use that contraption anymore. Thank you, Dr. Beetole, I said. She'd said just through Sunday. So I'd slept in my own bed next to Karen Ann. We ordered pizza and sat around watching TV, getting Hanley to smile and rolling a ball with Dylan, or rolling Dylan like a ball, peeling laughter. After feeding Hanley, we put both kids in their beds and the evening was calm. Tuesday morning came soon, and the memory of our first lovemaking in many months lingered. I have always loved waking with the memory of sex the night before. In this case, with the birth of Hanley just 9 weeks before, Karen and refusing to use all the maternity leave near the end of the school year, and then the shooting, life had not been conducive to romance. Last night had been wonderful if a little sticky, but very refreshing for my confidence. Karen and was up and dressing again for school, this time in a nice pants outfit. I watched her. She finished, saw me watching her in the mirror, and then came over. She sat beside me, put her arm across me, leaned down and kissed me softly. I have to go now. The kids will be with Mom and Dad. You don't need to worry about them. She said it all very softly. She leaned in and kissed me again, stood, and turned. At the door she looked back and said, "Goodbye, John." "Have a good day, Karen Ann," I replied. She shook her head and left. The very last day must be hard, I thought. It was about 10:15 a.m. that the doorbell chimed. I was dressed and presentable when I opened it. There stood a very young, smiley, high school senior type girl with a ponytail, and shorts and a sleeveless shirt. She wore sunglasses and smiled brightly. "John Buck?" "Yes." "Oh, you hurt your hand," she said. "Here. You are served," she said, putting a manila envelope in my left hand. I almost swooned. I saw the word divorce among others on the envelope. Me? I asked the little girl if she had the right address, the right name, the right me. "Yes, sir, you are John Buck at this address, sued by Karen and Prin Buck." "I see this a lot," she said in a perky, "what can you do" voice. "Well, sorry, gotta go." And she hopped off the steps and out to her dinky car. She pulled away. "I guess you're older than you look," I thought. I had a large envelope of papers in my hand, but I couldn't think of what to do. I stood there for some time. I went inside finally, where it was cool. I sat at the kitchen table and thought, but my mind was completely blank. I searched for my cell phone and finally found it, but Karen and didn't pick up. I left a message. "Karen, what's this all about? Divorce? Please, explain what's happening." Next, I called her school. The school secretary said, "She took today off, Mr. Buck." She said she had a lot of things to clear up and needed to go out of town. She promised to finish up here next week or so. I called her parents, Rose and Bob Prin, never great fans of mine, but not bad people. "Hello, Rose? This is John. Do you know what's going on with Karen Ann? I was just served with divorce papers. I can't reach her, and the school says she's out of town. Do you know?" "Oh, John," said Rose with sympathy in her tone. But then I heard her give the phone to Bob. "Yeah, John, she told us about it yesterday when she picked up the kids," he said. "You should look carefully at the papers, John. especially about the kids, okay? She had to make a move to be sure they get what's coming to them. What do you mean, the kids? What? They're not yours, John. She had a long affair with a doctor named Dunstan. They're his kids, and she's going to make sure they get their inheritance. He said he'd take care of them. She was planning on marrying him in 6 months anyway, so this was ready to go. I felt a weight of emotion in my chest. I was quiet a while, unable to talk and thinking of what I wanted to know. Did you know of the affair, sir? Before last night? I asked. He said nothing, but I heard him breathing, so I knew the answer. I hung up. I had never felt this way. Heartbreak was devastating. It crushed. I thought, is this survivable? It was so overwhelming. How many suffering this sudden desolation would stop their heart by force of will alone if they could? I didn't understand why my heart kept beating. Who wanted to live at this price? I felt the thump of my heart. I stood outside myself and was enlightened. I understood so much better some of the passionate and heart-rending passages in literature and Bible. Dr. Zhivago, Anna Karenina, I understood a woman swooning at such a moment, or a man descending into his cups, perhaps never again to emerge. I understood the old laws allowing an outraged husband to murder adulteress and paramour. I understood countless songs of betrayal and loss and disappointment. Karen Ann. I shook my head. I cried out. Me. I remembered a professor of philosophy who once told our freshman class, "You want to get what you deserve in life? What you deserve. What the hell do you deserve in life? What is promised you out of the womb?" Hobbes says one thing, Locke another, Kant, Nietzsche. What you deserve. Hasn't the idea of original sin made any impression on you Christians? Most of us are hoping we don't get what we deserve. He was a Catholic philosopher and wore no socks. Karen Ann called about 11:30 that long Tuesday, in the evening. "John, how's the hand?" she asked. Now she noticed. She was probably very concerned. "Fine. The kids are not mine?" "No. Sean knocked me up the first time he did me. It was wonderful. I have those 2 little angels to remind me of him. Was I already dead?" I descended emotionally into petulance, whining, and outrage. I saw it in myself, knew it was pitiable, but I was unable to stop the sinking. "Are you trying to hurt me?" I asked. "No, of course not," she replied breezily, affectedly. "It's just that you, someone like you, will never understand what we had. Sean and I. It was transcendent, beyond normal love. He was a man such as women dream to love them. I count my time with him as the best of my life, the best it could be." I felt something in her words contradictory to the reality of a years-long affair, but I couldn't identify it yet. It was fantastic, unrealistic, and rationalizing. She had lived with this explanation for some time, I thought, and believed it now. I'd always considered her mature and down-to-earth. I hadn't perceived this part of her personality. "I thought you loved me." Were those words meaningless? I was building my pain, hurting myself, wanting more of it. I needed the pain to hurt as much as possible. I wanted to never have been born. Oh no, not meaningless. Perhaps I misinterpreted my feelings as love. She sounded tired, or bored. It's hard to explain. What Sean and I had was special. We were about to tell you, by the way, but the shooting ended that. He was not like you. He was first rank. He won at life. He was respected, admired, so famous, talented. Sean said after I became pregnant with Dylan, Dylan was Sean's middle name, by the way, that he would provide for his son in his will. Later he said the same for Hanley. It will be read after the funeral Thursday. Hanley was his mother's maiden name. I notified the lawyer I'd be there tomorrow to meet the family. There's some sort of pre-funeral gathering for those in the will. I know nothing about them, either. Sean never once mentioned them. Anyway, they'll probably be thrilled to find he has 2 kids. Her disjointed, breathless explanation seemed too breezy, too much an attempt to sophisticate a tawdry choice. I assumed he was probably too busy screwing her to talk about mundane things like responsibility and family. A man like that did first things first. I felt myself descending further emotionally. "How do you know they're his?" I asked, afraid I knew. "I used a diaphragm with you. You never noticed it, did you? Then I did DNA tests. Right after each was born. You never suspected, did you?" She laughed a little, but then must have realized how it would seem to me. Mrs. Grigsby across the street said she wondered if I had a different husband in the summer. Sean was over so much during the days. I had to beg her not to tell you. "Oh my God. So the neighbors knew?" Her parents knew. Terry Marks's voice was more understandable now. Was I last to know? Did they all cover for her? The kids were not mine and about to inherit probably a bundle, Karen, and had become hateful, and they did it here? In our bed? I asked. I heard her sigh. Yes, many times. He wanted the firmer mattress, by the way. I'd have to change the sheets right as you got home, she said, obviously to diminish me. I've come to terms with his death. At first I couldn't. I hung up, thinking some grief is beyond words. I wondered but knew in my heart that the second miscarriage was Sean's child. The mattress, the children, the wanton acts, the disrespect, the glossing, the contraception without my knowledge, the insults, the whole affair. That was the first night I drank too much over Karen and Dylan and Hanley. I didn't take any of my pain pills, but I considered taking them all. I stared at that little bottle for a minute, maybe two. I awoke the next day around noon. It was a hangover like other hangovers, only more so, I thought, remembering that wonderful, sleepless, but now meaningless night that we cuddled watching Casablanca only a month ago. I cleaned up, dressed, and found a divorce lawyer recommended by someone's friend. I took all the papers over to him about 3 that Wednesday afternoon. He was a heavy guy, about 50, with a mustache and longer hair than a man that age should have. In any event, he seemed sharp and successful. "How'd you hurt your hand?" he asked after I came in the office. I sat, and he took the papers behind the desk. He started scanning. "Got shot at the hospital," I said. He stopped looking at the papers and looked at me. "And she served you yesterday?" he said, at that point shaking his head and whistling. He looked back at the papers. "Oh, I see. The father, Dunstan, killed at the hospital?" he asked. "And she served you yesterday?" he said, at that point shaking his head and whistling. He looked back at the papers. "Oh, I see. The father, Dunstan, killed at the hospital?" he asked. "Yes. You never knew?" "Nope, not a clue." He read everything with me there, an hour's worth. Then he sat back and blew out a long breath. "Mr. Buck, this is one of the most heartless, evil things I've ever seen a woman do. Craven, the callousness. You go through something like that, and it turns out to be the catalyst for your own divorce," he said and shook his head. "Her parents said she intended to divorce me and marry him," I said. "Likely story," he harumphed, skeptical. "Guys string these gals along with promises, and usually there's nothing there but a roll in the hay. You say she's at a meeting about his will, and the reading is later?" "That's what I was told." "I'd like to be a fly on the wall at that meeting," he said. Then he lowered the boom. He said I had little recourse legally or practically. I had been a caretaking father, but he said she threatened to claim abuse and other things if I didn't agree to the terms offered. It's in lawyer language, so there is no implied coercion. But it is there, and every lawyer in the country would recognize it. No shared custody, no visitation, clear out of the house by Friday night. No contact with the kids, but also no alimony or child support. Obviously, she expects a bundle in the will and does not want you to have a claim to her money or the kids. The kids are so young she's claiming you, and they are not bonded yet. And since no biological connection exists, she wants complete authority, period. The court is likely to agree, as that would prevent years of haggling over visitation and custody, alimony, child support. Cut the bond before it's strong, especially since your job does not provide enough means for their support. He looked at me, steepled his fingers. "I'll do anything you want, Mr. Buck, but you cannot afford and would probably lose any demand for shared custody or frequent visitation. You might get some once-a-week visits, maybe with a chaperone, especially if she claims abuse. It could be dirty, and some people never recover from even unfounded charges." He stopped talking, and a few seconds of silence followed with him looking at me. "So?" I asked. "What do you want, Mr. Buck?" "I just want my life back. My kids, I know they are not mine, but I love them." I couldn't go on for a second. "But I have no means to raise them on my own. My life is falling apart. I'm recently crippled. I need to think." I sat for a minute, eyes closed, still hungover and feeling my heartbeat behind my eyes. I said, "I need a few days. I'll contact you by Friday. Okay? I'll check with you Friday morning if you don't come in by 11, he said. I wondered at that. Concern? He saw the sunken eyes, the half-shaved face, the rumpled clothes. I stood. I held out my left hand and we shook. He asked, "How'd you get hit?" "Shot my own damn hand." We laughed. Not the first to do that. That meeting in Connecticut was probably over by the time I left my lawyer and walked out into the sunshine of a late afternoon. As it turned out, there was a fly on the wall in that room in Connecticut. He wore a clerical collar. Early that evening, the phone rang. It was the fly. "John? This is Mike." Father Michaels, pronounced Michaelus, would call himself Mike in private conversation, but it was the first time he'd done it with me that I could remember. Yes, sir. I didn't expect a call. I'm in Connecticut, and I wanted to check up on you to see if you were all right. I'm caught up in the estate distribution for Dr. Dunstan. We have some insurance and investment involvement with him. The man left a lot of loose ends. I saw your wife here, but we were in different parts of the room. She saw me but didn't come over. Yes, sir. She sued me for divorce. She contended our children were Dunstan's and she believes she has some claim on his property, I explained. There was a long pause, not as if the man was shocked, but as if the statement deserved consideration. Yes, I figured a lot of that out. Your wife was under the impression that Dr. Dunstan was not married, he said. Or at least I believe so. However, all his insurance papers listed a spouse still married to him. Mrs. Dunstan is here with their 2 kids living in the Dunstan family house. The family's been here since the early 1800s. Karen introduced herself as Dr. Dunstan's fiancée, which brought a hush to the room of perhaps 40 people. His wife walked up to her and smacked her across the face. That's how she found out about the wife. Karen Ann's staying in the same motel I am. Karen must have felt humiliated. I felt like laughing but held on. He went on. Anyway, all were given copies of his will. Nothing was stipulated as confidential. The official reading is after the funeral. I will be there, but the lawyers for family and various investments and businesses are much in agreement. The insurance money goes to his wife, per the contract. His private investments will be split among his children, now totaling 4, with your 2. Investments were a little over $1 million, so not inconsequential. The surviving parent is trustee of the children's money. The lawyers agree it does not mean the wife has control of Dylan's and Hanley's shares, but that Karen would fulfill that role for them. There is no provision in the will for Karen by either name or implication. The wife inherits the house and a special fund to pay its taxes for probably 10 years, our lawyer says. Also, 2 companies will be sold and the proceeds go to the family, with his wife getting his share. Oh, she gets the joint checking account. He allowed me a moment to feel smug. I squelched the urge to exult. None of this was good. There was nothing good in finding out you've been manipulated deviously and considered contemptible. There was no joy in discovering your wife and your marriage were ruined by lies. I'm sorry, Karen, and didn't realize. Perhaps, I said, it would have had a different outcome if she'd known more about him. I almost felt that Father Michaels was nodding. He sounded sorry for her. My experience with adulterers is that the longer they deceive, the more disdainful they become of the ignorant husband or wife. They see trust as stupidity. They give credence to their new lovers. I agree, Father. I think analyzing it was a way to distance myself from the devastation of the situation. In the end, they're pitiful, he said. Always. He paused a moment. She expected a bigger payout from Dunstan. That was obvious to everyone at the meeting. What if she withdraws the suit, or asks for alimony, or whatever? What will you do? He wanted to know if the marriage could be salvaged. To live with Karen again. To wonder for life if it was marriage, or if the cucking continued. To fulfill not the role of consummate lover, but at best, acceptable substitute? I said, I think it's too late for us. She was hateful, almost gloating, telling me about her affair with him, as if her affair made her more important. She was ashamed of me. I don't know, Father. I'll talk to my lawyer first. It's hard when your wife turns away. I always expected to turn to her in times of trouble. Calmly, he said, I'll see you in a few days or next week. We have some important things to discuss about changing your job. I think you'll like them. I hope so, anyway. I'll see you when you're able to come by. Thanks, Father. He was leaving me with something positive to anticipate. Perhaps he had a psychology degree among all his others. I felt like a great evil had settled into me. I understood the idea of possession by the devil. It suddenly didn't seem so ridiculous. How was it possible to feel such pain, and such pain without physical injury? My hand was as nothing. I lay dying emotionally, and it was my body doing it to itself, creating pain out of the strength of love that was betrayed, unrequited, blind, spousal, and paternal. It was in my chest, solid and tangible, and if Sean Dunstan were alive, he could have opened me up and found it there, a mass of solid pain the size of a softball. I beseeched a God I hardly admitted, but it was really a wallow. Could I die now? Please? What more could you want? She loved me never, gave herself to another from the second month we were living together, disdained me, took my family, and threatened to allege evil and unfounded abuse. My children were not mine. A wave like nausea passed through me. How would I tell Mom? Dad? Such anguish cannot be borne. I wanted to smash my one good fist into a bookcase. I poured the first of 2 doubles then. I brooded of Sean Dunstan. Had he ever seen his children? Held them? Kissed them? Had he tickled Dylan or smiled into Hanley's eyes? Did Dylan run to him for a hug? Had he felt jealous of my time with him? Of my time with Karen Ann? I fell asleep from too much liquor and too much anguish, with one thought bouncing about my mind. All affairs were fantasies. The day of Sean Dunstan's funeral, I woke on the couch about 4:30 a.m., unable to sleep and thinking I would have to leave my house after one more night. I packed my things, preparing them for removal. It didn't take long. It was surprising how little I owned. Lots of books were disposable, a few not. Clothes I threw in boxes or bins, but really, our lack of great means resulted in a frugality that was quite efficient. I filled some boxes and stacked clothes on hangers on the back seat of my car. I had a football, a ball glove, and a basketball in a box I forced into the trunk. Some tools I stacked on the passenger seat and floor. All of my possessions were in one used Ford. I could no longer avoid a certain moment. I drove over to my parents' house about 10. "Mom, Dad, we need to sit." "Please," I said, holding it together. I told them everything. That the children were not mine, that I did not see a way out, that Karen Ann was angry and hateful to me, and that she was now disappointed in Dunstan. My dad nodded with his head down and jowls hanging. My mom looked as if the whole world were crumbling. We were in adjacent seats and she clasped her hands behind my neck and tears ran down her face. She was silent. Dad suggested coffee. Understanding the bleary eyes and disheveled appearance I presented as soon as I started talking. I told them that Karen Ann had an order forcing me from the house, that the lawyer said she was prepared to allege emotional and maybe other abuse if I did not comply with her request and sign the papers. Mom cried out at that, realizing the grandchildren were never more her grandchildren. She understood completely. Mom was the smartest of us. There was little chance she could maintain a relationship with them if Karen Ann and I were at odds. I thought we would always be at odds now. I don't think Mom ever recovered from this blow. She aged about 20 years as we discussed the situation sitting at the kitchen table and drinking coffee. She lived a long while yet, but she became an old lady that day. Her eyes and her movements changed. She sank into senility almost gratefully when it started 10 years later, as if appreciative that the burdens of life would now rest elsewhere. She had things to be very happy about by then, including grandchildren, but love was love, and it wasn't based on DNA tests. She saw the kids occasionally at a market or park, but after a few months, she was effectively a stranger. They had other paternal grandparents in New England, even if estranged. Her last few years, descending into dementia, Mom would wander about the yard and talk to herself, talk to plants or animals, lost in the netherworld of her mind, imagining people from her life. We would laugh gently, talking about it among ourselves, seeing her good life exposed by her condition and wishing that time didn't pass for such people. I found her one day, standing beside a tree, talking. Drawing closer, she saw me and asked, "Do you think Dylan and Hanley can come by for lunch?" Karen Ann eventually realized what she'd done and I think regretted it, but that didn't change it. She squandered the love of 3 generations. I slept fitfully, and for the last time in our house, on our couch. For all I knew, Karen Ann and Sean may have had sex on our couch as well, but I knew they had used the bed. It was a long night looking often at the clock on the TV box, waiting for morning, drifting in and out of sleep. Friday came finally. Again, I awoke early, shaved, showered and dressed in a loose polo shirt. I decided to try to see Dr. Beatole a day early. The huge bandage was dirty, impossible and awkward. I still had pain, but I rarely took a pain pill, and I had gone a night without drinking, so things were probably improving, at least for my hand. God's abode was cleaned up, windows were repaired, bullet holes were filled, painting was ongoing, and damaged counters, desks and tables were removed. There remained a few extra police in the building and on the grounds, but they were in regular uniforms and just keeping an eye on things. I went to my office and it was still there, still small, still as I had left it. I called to see if I could advance my appointment with Dr. Beatole, who was already operating this morning. I left a message and a half hour later, they called to confirm for 9. I straightened my desk, threw away some old papers with which I'd failed to deal and looked at my calendar when there was a knock. "Come in," I said, and Father Michaels entered, closing the door behind him. I stood. "Father, you do get around quickly," I said. He held out his left hand and we shook. I learned to manage sleep when in seminary I was sent to some cloistered nuns, getting up at midnight to pray, then working until 3, then another hour or 2 of sleep. He shook his head. "Astounding, really. Remarkable women. Last night I caught a late flight and got in about 1. I thought he had another purpose also. A morning flight would have been soon enough for business. We sat and talked, starting with the reading of the will and then to other topics. It was as we discussed. Dunstan has 4 known children now. They will divide the investments. Mrs. Buck was almost shunned by the family. They were quite rude to her, openly rude, but the lawyer-executor kept things civil. The kids will get their dispersal, probably in some months. My business there was concluded quickly. Our lawyer is still there to wrap up one loose end, but nothing to do with you. He looked straight at me and said, "Tell me about what you intend to do." Taking a deep breath, I said, "She detests me. She said she was with him because I was a loser." Their love was transcendent. I couldn't keep the cynicism from my voice, which I realized as soon as I spoke, so I hesitated and waved my one hand to apologize. She gloated about them having sex so often in our bed. She was so hateful. I was shocked. He shook his head. "This whole thing. I saw it and didn't act," he said. I knew he was seeing different women. I didn't know Karen and was one until the meeting before the funeral. I was taught in management classes that the discreet affair should be left to those involved. That's a mistake, especially for an institution rooted in the perception of morality and goodness. It can't be discreet if I know of it. I'll think about this and change how I deal with these things in the future. I looked at my situation, trying for objectivity. I wasn't disgusted. I was bereft. We're in our late 20s, Father. These should be the years for us. Babies and sex and building a family, and here I am without one. My wife abhors me and I wonder if I've lost every decent dream. He looked at me. He was a Jesuit. He said, "I know you don't have faith, but I pray you find your way to God, John." I met Karen and only twice that I remember. I hope she finds her way to a more loving outlook. It appears that you will soon be ostracized from the children for whom you struggled all of your adult life. Don't sink. Overcome. You're that guy that wins out in the end. I've seen it in you. God in you. His hand was on my shoulder. The God solution, huh? I said. He talked about an approach to solving problems, and to other things over the years, and it always involved introspection, calm, and seeking over time. He didn't believe in quick solutions to social problems. We called it his God solution behind his back. Always, he said, smiling. Now, you said you have to leave your home? Tonight? Yes, everything's in my car. I could go to my parents, but they're so upset seeing me might upset them more. About Karen and the grandkids. I have a solution. I know a guy who needs help paying his utilities, but he wouldn't charge you any rent. Might want you to help with chores. Share grocery bills. I can probably get it set up today. Give me until the afternoon, or I'll come find you. Thanks so much, Father, I said. I had never thought of Landon Michaels as my friend, but it appeared he was interested, or grateful or loyal. When do you get the hand looked at? He asked. 9 today. Well, Tara's the best. We'll talk about your job after that sometime. Today, tomorrow, soon. There is a lot happening for you and fast, so I'll just give you the gist. Most of the larger hospitals have a department that monitors professional development. Doctors, nurses, much what you are assisting now, but on a more formal basis. I would like to create that department and enlarge your duties and responsibilities. Right now, the departments handle it in-house, but that won't work as we grow. We'll talk. Think about it. I don't know when it would start. Early next year, once we obtained approval and remodeled some. I'll get back to you. Father, I don't know what to say. It sounds like a career. He was nodding and looking directly at me. Yeah, it does to me too. Dr. Beetle liked the look of my hand and reduced the size of my next bandage by 2/3. I could now wear regular shirts, although buttons would be very hard with the offhand doing all the work. She told me to come back in another week. Alone with her in the examining room, the door shut. She said, I know there is some reason to keep your name out of the press, but I just wanted to say, I think it was terribly brave. I had assumed you were shot by the terrorists. I didn't realize you were the one who ended the attack. How'd you get shot then? She had a look of genuine sincerity and respect. I had not seen much of that. The one guy had a pistol pointed right at the lady's head. I was afraid if I shot him in the head, he'd squeeze the trigger. So I knocked the pistol up as I shot him. The bullet went through him and hit my hand. She shook her head. And you still shot the other guy then? You're a hero, John, you know? You saved a lot of us, and someday it'll be okay to let people know. I hope. Kind words, I replied, smiling. If I were just a little more graceful, I might have escaped shooting myself. Thanks for everything, Tara. I'll be back in a week. The cell rang as I returned to my office. It was becoming a busy Friday, and I'd done none of my usual work. Hello? John? It was Karen Ann. I said nothing then. John? I heard you. Say what you have to say. I should not have said what I said, John. Silence. Finally, I spoke. I was your biggest fan, Karen, and I told people I had married the best person I'd ever met. I lionized you. She said, I was wrong about some things. I know now. We can save it if we just stop, Karen, and no man of any character could stay in a marriage with a woman who felt as you did about me. There's no argument. What could you possibly want of me? What is there to build on? I asked. I can't be married to you. You threatened to claim? But my voice quit and my mouth kept moving. I tried to make my voice hard. I had no voice. She said, John, you are being so unreasonable. Don't you love the kids? I found my voice at the idea that coercion could be negotiated out of our relationship. Unreasonable? The issue is character. You have made children into property and I don't have any claim. You abandoned me and took them. You threatened to fabricate the most evil acts in my relationship with them. Unreason is not the issue. A father is more than a guy. He's that one who does what's best for the family even when it hurts. It's hard for me, but I must. I'll sign your papers in a few minutes. She said, You're cruel. My voice was hard now, as I finally understood my feelings and my situation. I don't suffer the destruction of my family gladly. You destroyed us. How could you even think of alleging abuse? And no one loved those children more than I. Not even you. I paused. Then I said, Did Dunstan even know them? Hold them? Play with Dylan? There was silence. Silence can be loud or full. This silence was both. I realized he knew neither child with any feeling and didn't care to know. His loss, I thought. Where do we go, John? She asked, and I thought for the first time she realized she had completely demolished us. You are Ugolino. You introduced Ruggieri into our family. I stopped because my anger was taking me too far. May God forgive you for him in our lives, I said. I shook my head, and there was silence on the phone. I wondered why she was still listening. Remorse? Loss? Hopelessness? Single motherhood? The kids still have potential. Perhaps you can salvage a decent life for them, I said quietly, angrily. But do me two favors. First, stop using my name. The kids can keep it if you wish. You made fun of it enough. I waited. I imagined her nodding on the other end of the line. She said, You said two favors. Yeah, take responsibility for this mess you called a marriage. And screw you. She said nothing. There was a long period of silence. I never used such language, even as a Marine. I heard her breathing. I decided I wanted her to know I was silently there, so I held the line open. Eventually, I heard her hang up. I immediately called my lawyer and said I had decided to sign the papers. I drove to his office, and he welcomed me with another left-handed shake. Reduced the bandages, huh? He said. Yeah. My wife called. Wanted to drop the whole thing, I think. But it's past that point. We were sitting by now, and I paused as more emotion passed through. I mean, low expectations shouldn't be the criteria to maintain a marriage. He nodded and pulled out the papers, marked with arrows for me to sign. He said, It wouldn't work. Men can't get past a sincere declaration that someone else is the pig's eye, or soulmate, or however they put it. Only when it's the only way to care for kids. I nodded and said, She has some money now. I signed with my left hand, making unrecognizable squiggles, squelching the teary feeling, knowing my eyes must have been shining. He said, Might be for the best then. I nodded, unable to talk. I pulled off my wedding ring and put it on the table. I'll take care of everything. In a month or so, it should be over. I'll let you know when the court says. I stood and held out my left hand. We shook. I shook my head because I didn't trust myself to speak. Something died when I signed those papers. My love had been sincere. You never get over the end of a family, even one as bad as mine had been. I returned to the hospital about 1 and found Father Michaels escorting some people toward my office. I walked in and he saw me. Mr. Buck, some people wanted to speak with you. That was when I recognized Tony Spagnol, his mother Marilyn, and a man I'd not met. Tony actually threw himself into my arms. His mom waited and hugged me next. Hello, I said, laughing and hugging them back. Mrs. Spagnol said, We wanted to thank you for saving us. This is my husband, Cal. Cal was standing with a little difficulty. I held out my left hand. John Buck, I said. Cal Spagnol, he replied, pronouncing it Spaniel, like a dog and clearing up a minor mystery, and we shook left-handed. He was holding onto a crutch with his right hand. We were here to take Cal home that morning when the terrorists came in. Knee surgery, she said. I hope everyone is doing well then, I said. Father Michaels was smiling at all concerned. It was a nice meeting of the anonymous. The Spagnolls were not releasing their names as hostages, just in case. We talked a few minutes. Cal asked about my hand and I explained how it happened. He shook his head, realizing my crippling was to protect his wife. Marilyn and Tony turned to leave then. Cal leaned into me and said, "Thank God for what you did, Buck." "I do. I thank him. And you? I can never repay." He shook his head and then my hand with his left and right, trapping the crutch under his arm. I shook my head. "I'd do it again. So would you, if you'd been there." Cal nodded in approval. Marilyn, Cal, and Tony were gone then. Father Michaels was smiling at them as they left. He was openly helping me fight depression. "Thanks, Mike," I said. No one could hear, and he smiled at my use of it. "I might get through this after all. We can get you counseling, you know? No charge. Hospital can." I shook my head. "No, you're doing enough. I spoke to Karen a few hours ago. She was trying to make amends, but it's beyond that. I signed the papers." He nodded. "I hate to see marriages break up. I hate the idea of divorce. Two loving people can always resolve things in time, with God's assistance. I really believe it." He sighed and looked at me sympathetically. "Not all marriages have two loving people. Some have one loving enough for two, and those marriages end long before the couples realize it. It's hard to." I stopped, unsure what I was going to say, and finally just shook my head. I chastised myself in my mind. "Now come on, not with my boss." Emotionally motivated speechlessness? "Let's take a ride," he said, ignoring my emotion. "I'll drive." He drove us only a mile or so down the street. "Found you a place. No rent, but you pay utilities to $300, and he'll pay the rest. You have a third of an old Gothic house. Your own bath, your own entrance, or use the common one. Use of the common rooms like the kitchen and living room. The fireplaces work. In good shape." "Sounds excellent, Father." I was overwhelmed. He pulled up behind the local Catholic church, our God's Abode parish. "Out," he said, and I stepped out. I realized what he was saying. I started to laugh. I couldn't help it. It tickled me, and with all the tragedy of the shooting, the hurt hand, the divorce, and losing the kids, I needed to laugh. "Yeah, what's so funny? You got me an apartment in a priest's house? A rectory? Yeah, what's the big deal? It'll save everybody money. Come on, Phil's inside. He's your housemate." I was still laughing as we climbed the steps. "I guess I don't have to worry about him bringing girls home at all hours?" "Probably not, but keep your eyes open." We knocked. I moved to my new digs. I had a separate bedroom in a spooky house built in the late 1800s. Dark hardwood floors and trim, chair rails, thick plaster, chandeliers, two fireplaces, one in the living room, the other in my bedroom, overstuffed chairs, and the mild smell of old cigar smoke throughout. A big, cannonball-topped, four-post bed of darkest wood looked that it could withstand the blitz. The building was built for 3 priests in the days when a large parish could afford and recruit them, back in the days when such an edifice could be built and bought. It was the nicest place I'd ever lived. Every appointment was the solid 19th century quality that lasted the 20th and into the 21st. It was dated, but I imagined Conan Doyle writing at the desk or Lincoln staring at the fireplace. Paintings were on every vertical surface. Jesus looked down from some walls, Mary or Joseph from others. There were portraits of various saints about. There was Saint Drogo, patron of the ugly. I wondered if whoever hung that painting did it with humor. I had never heard of the Infant of Prague or Saint Margaret of Chichester. I began to understand the insinuation, the very extent, of Catholic guilt. Father Philip was older and sharp-witted, the local parish priest, a transplant from the other side of the archdiocese. I had access to the whole house, use of my own bathroom, and a woman would come in to clean once a week. I had to cook for Father and myself when I could. After one meal, Father decided to cook for both of us. Father Philip said he was an alcoholic, so I was not to have spirits on the premises. I told him there would be no problem. I was out of rye whiskey anyway. With this simple agreement, I avoided alcoholism. From that Friday, that very busy Friday, my life started to wind down to a reasonable pace. The crises of violence, confrontations, family disintegration, and difficult decisions were hopefully behind. Some of that credit should go to those 2 priests doing so much for a non-Catholic in distress. Part of it was allowing me time and space. The God solution. Think about it and how it affects you. Pray, look at the options, discuss it with people who will help, and you will find a solution. Drop the God part and almost everyone would agree. Calm down, think it through, learn what you can, talk it over, and make a decision. Then watch how it progresses and react appropriately, doing all those things again. I shook my head at the thought. It was practically the scientific method. Father Philip and I began to talk on those evenings he was free. He was 67, had served as a chaplain in the Gulf War, and had performed more baptisms, weddings, and last rites than he could count. He played poker, never lost, and liked a nip or 15, and that had been his undoing. He'd been assigned here after drying out. It was a plum assignment, and he had been in it for 13 years now. He did not have long left, one way or the other. His health was not great, and it was time for him to retire anyway. He told me about the problems he'd handled over the years. He loved the relationship with the parish elementary school. He was humbly, and he claimed easily, celibate. We discussed our work, our lives, baseball, world peace, soccer, football, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and argued about the Gospel of Thomas from Nag Hammadi, anything. He got me to read parts of Gospels, supposed Gospels, novels. He had me crawl under the old wooden dining room table and shine a spotlight up, and there were the names of every priest to serve in the parish and live in the house, written in pencil. Over 100 years of priests were listed there. We talked about it. We discussed a line or a book for hours on some nice evenings. My evenings closed my days in peace and quiet, reading, and friendly conversation. Thank heaven we were both Reds fans. I came to love the evenings. Occasionally he'd smoke a cigar on the porch, but he said he never did inside. I avoided details about my impending divorce, nor did I tell him about my part in the shootings. June ended, and July came in hotter than ever. Our air conditioning was stalwart, but upstairs I needed a fan overnight to sleep. It was comfortable with that. I went back to work at regular hours. In the second week of July, Father Michaels came in to talk about my job. He sat across from me. You know, I've been looking at ways we can keep you at the hospital. I mean, it's tragic to lose good people because of lack of a strong career pathway in a growing hospital. John, if you're interested, I'd like to propose some ideas to the board. If you're interested, he said. I was touched. He was going out of his way to help me. He acted as if I had options. I'd like to send you to a program in Cleveland for new hospital administrators, where they will teach you about all the licensing, accrediting, and certifying rules for the various major medical fields. I understand they include some work on hospital and doctor contracts. They have connections to programs all over the world. Sending a doctor off to be trained should not cost our hospital the benefit of the training. Hopefully, once you get back here, we can set up a program to help the doctors identify their deficiencies and strengths. We can then include nurses and other professions. We need to build upgrading and relicensing into our professionals' contracts so they don't go away and stay there. I want the best of our doctors to want to stay here, for their families to stay in Sky Gray. That idea took a big hit with the massacre. He shook his head. I realized he expected to fight to prove Sky Gray was a good place to raise a family. He went on. The program will get you some graduate credits. Once you finish in Cleveland, I'd like you to begin a course in health admin or hospital management. There are several around that I think would help. Or one in hospital law, not malpractice hospital. Maybe a sabbatical down the road, for a master's. You want me to work toward a degree, Father? I asked. I do. You'll have some choices to make if you want the career here. As we start a new department, I don't see how one person could do it. Bigger hospitals have a department to help the doctors and nurses maintain or improve their ratings. I've seen some. We'd have to add an assistant once your initial training was over and you were attempting to establish a program. Then one or two more, within a short time. I could help you with all of this, but some of it would be similar to what you have been doing, but of course on a much more rigorous basis. We'll arrange for you to finish a program in hospital management, or personnel, or a related field like law. Hell, a law degree makes sense. I'd never been excited about my job before. Next step is writing it up. Could you get me started? Investigate University Hospital in Cincinnati. They have a huge number of doctors and first-rate facilities and reputation. Find out how they do it. Get me some notes and then a short essay about all the elements. Notes don't have to be fancy or perfect, but make the essays good. I may want to use them when I talk to the board. Maybe a week for the first. If you need more time, let me know. You'll have to meet up with them, interview people. Okay. I was smiling. Yes, sir. I'll call as soon as you leave here. Notes first. I want to see what you're running into. Every day you can send them to me by email or paper, as often as you can. I can give you some help with phone calls. I looked at him and considered his purposes. I was sure he knew what this sort of job entailed. It sounded like some of the lines I'd read in his Vita, positions he'd held at other hospitals early in his career. He was training me, sending me to investigate things he already knew, making sure I learned how such a professional human resources department worked. Apparently, he had faith in my abilities and wanted to marshal me along into a career. Great, sir. I know some people in that department at UC. I'll call them right away and see what they think. So my new job began. I was excited and scared I might be in over my head. I would have been, but there were several people holding me up. I had my hand examined another time by good Dr. Beatole, who pronounced it much improved and one of her best jobs. She said I should continue to wrap it for the rest of the summer. She also had some ointment to help healing and prevent infections. The scars were vicious looking and made me wonder if I'd ever be able to make a fist. As it was, I could move all my fingers with some pain. Weeks and then a month had passed since the shooting, and hot day followed hot night. I didn't see the children. I didn't see Karen, and life was comfortable but empty for me. Anonymity suited me like a glove, but without children or wife, I was lonely in ways no friendly priest could assuage. Indeed, I'd always been anonymous. Except for 2 Homeland investigators and the 2 priests, I didn't think anyone knew where I lived, not even my parents. There was great conjecture in the media still about who had killed the terrorists. The shadowy YouTube cell phone video was brightened and enhanced to the point I thought I could recognize me, but I didn't think anyone else could. No one had ever considered me in such a role, so that aided my anonymity. The one thing it showed clearly was the effect of the round hitting my right hand. Luckily, I was just one of several people who had been wounded in the arm or hand, so I didn't stand out. There was an interview with the mayor of Skygray, who called me a hero and a humble man. Special Agent Remark was interviewed once and just said, "The man's identity will not be divulged." I sat on the porch one night with Father Phil and wondered how it would turn out. We discussed marriage in general terms, my divorce, and the right thing to do. He didn't judge. He of course disapproved of divorce, but the sin was in sex outside the marriage. For the church, the divorce was not recognized. He recommended a book by Evelyn Waugh about a divorced Catholic, another one to read, I thought. One thing about living with Phil, he always had a book to recommend. This one was a comedy, though somewhat subdued, about World War II. There was no humor to the end of my marriage. July 24th, the divorce was final. I didn't even have to go to the hearing, but my lawyer stopped in at the hospital to drop off the papers. It was all as the original request had asked. My lawyer said, "The judge asked me why your name was so illegible and I explained you'd been wounded at the hospital." He had some things to say to your ex-wife then. He didn't change any of the terms, but she had to hear it. She said nothing, and her lawyer was not happy. Goodbye to all that. I like to quote book titles when appropriate. We shook left hands. Good luck, John. I am so sorry, really. I know this was not what you wanted in your life. I think he understood. I was not married. I drove to Mom and Dad's and showed them the paper. There was a tragedy within tragedy as Mom nodded and said nothing, and Dad nodded and said nothing worth printing. I hugged them and left after a few minutes. There was nothing to do. Dylan and Hanley were no more mine. If they ever had been, there was nothing to do. Nothing to do. The supreme happiness of life is the conviction that we are loved, Lord Byron said. Had Karen and loved me once and lost it? Dylan was conceived within 2 months of our living together after I was finished with active duty. We were not in hardship. We would soon be crowded if we'd had a child. We were anyway with Dylan. Had I ever been loved? There was only one way to answer. No, a Byronic no. That evening, Phil and I talked about the finality of the divorce. I was melancholy. He called Father Mike, and we all sat on the porch, watching the stars and sipping iced tea. We talked about Karen and the kids, and how I could never do anything for them again. I raised my glass, a toast, to celebrating a divorce with 1 unavowed and 2 avowed celibates. We laughed and tapped glasses. I decided to tell Phil the details of my marriage. I sipped. I waved my hand, signifying that something had gone with the wind. After the massacre, my wife confessed that she had a long, ongoing affair with one of the victims, Sean Dunstan, the surgeon. She said that she didn't know if she had ever loved me. She called me a loser. My children, it turns out, are not mine. I love them, but I'm not their biological father. I was advised that I had little legal foundation to sue for custody or even visitation. My wife threatened to allege that I had abused them or her. After what happened in the massacre, it was just too much. I had no place to go. Father Mike led me here. I sipped again. I waited. I am truly grateful, Father. You're not Catholic? No, I'm not much of anything. Oh, you are, John. From what Father Mike has said, and anyone who knows you can see it. Not the woman I married, I thought, but I respected his attempt to raise my self-esteem. Mike stood then. I need to get on. Thank you for a wonderful divorce party, both of you. I admit I've never been invited to one before. I've heard some can be quite raucous. John, I'll see you tomorrow. He left then, walking toward the hospital. I didn't think he was ever done for the day. Wonderful? Oh yeah, suffering brings us closer to God. I tempered my thoughts. Phil spoke quietly, So this Dunstan, a good doctor? It was all over the paper that he was one of the victims. Yeah, a great doctor, but... Phil sat quietly, holding his iced tea in both hands before him, as I am sure he'd held whiskey 2 decades before. He spoke, looking at his tea. 2 broken marriages, yours and his. 2 unacknowledged children in your Hanley and Dylan. Living 5 states from his other children and wife. Apparently other affairs. He sipped. We looked out at Venus, showing in the early evening gloom. After a bit, I said, he saved a lot of lives with his surgery. Phil nodded. There is that. I'm sure Peter kept track of it all. Phil could be droll. About a week later, August now, on Thursday evening, Phil and I were discussing the news on the porch again, and he changed the subject. John, he began. I've watched you and your depression is continuing. I understand the divorce has left a vile taste in your mouth, but it's more than that, isn't it? I nodded in the darkening evening. I'm a minor hospital administrator, Father. I make less than a teacher, and there is no advancement. Right now I'm trusting Father Michaels. He intends to expand my job. I'm excited but scared that I won't do well, or that it won't amount to anything significant, or they'll drop me for all the more qualified people. So far, I've written 2 essays and submitted notes about 2 hospital programs we will use to guide us. And I miss the kids, family life. Hanley is 4 months old and Dylan 2 years. I don't want my next wife to have low expectations. If there is a next wife, my mind is a mishmash of anguish, I guess. Phil nodded. Your heart too, he said almost inaudibly. The wind blew hot, and we were not cooled on the porch. I heard music from a house across the street. He rocked. I drifted languorously in an Adirondack chair, perspiring gently as the day's heat wafted. Phil finished his tea. It is hot this evening, isn't it? He said. Yeah, I responded. My iced tea was gone. Phil looked down, pursed his lips, and then looked at me. Would you attend Mass with me tomorrow, John? This is my early one, once a week. A few old men attend, 2 or 3 women. It would humor me. I've never been to Mass before. I don't believe, Father. He smiled and chuckled. Oh, it's not so bad. We even call it a celebration. What else are you doing at 6:30? I'll wake you. It was 5:30 when Philip knocked on my door. John, we leave at 6. Mass at 6:30 in the building. The church was all of 50 feet from the back door of the rectory, so I was now up in plenty of time. I even showered and shaved. I wrapped my hand again with clean bandages. We arrived at 6:05 and Philip wore a vest. Catholic clergy have particular garments and things to do for every situation or date. I sat in a pew, the lone person, and even knelt for a bit on the padded kneeler and prayed. It was not awful, actually pleasant, if very early. There were a few older men who wandered in, one with a walker. 2 older women, a young man perhaps 25, and a tiny woman about 30 eventually arrived. Father entered, and Mass began. Philip went through the ritual quickly. He had no helpers, called servers, I learned, and so performed all tasks himself. He did have a sermon, and I listened. I think he meant this part for me, and I later found he meant it for several of us. There are times when good men or women are in a quagmire. There is deceit in their lives, betrayal, failure. There seems to be no love for these good people, and it is easy to sink into despair. Despair is not the worst thing. Perhaps they are even right. It is a time for despair, but don't let despair be the end of it. There's something good for you after it. Come out of it. Find someone to love. Help someone find love. There is goodness, there is joy, there is life for all of us. Life itself is a gift of God. Accept that it's good, that despair ends, and there will be love. You will find the way that is best if you're open to love. He looked at me and quoted Hugo, "It is nothing to die. It is frightful not to live." I'd never thought of that idea, including responsibility. Had Dunstan never lived, or lived only partially? Was I being adjured to live fully? It's difficult to realize the depths with which many have examined morality or religion or life. Phil was one, I now saw. He seemed an old guy with his heart on his sleeve, reading Garcia Marquez or John Galsworthy, but there was reason in his ideas. Philosophy and learning beyond scripture were inside every sermon. I wondered later if he really believed in all the dogmas of his church, or if he accepted them because he saw such a moral goodness at its heart. When Mass ended, Father Philip simply announced it, walked down the center aisle to the back of the nave, and began to speak with the congregants. There were laughter and friendship in this large, largely empty, Catholic building. I met Joe and Richard, 2 veterans of Korea and Vietnam, with welcoming left handshakes. I just said I'd injured my hand at work. They were impressed I'd been in the service, and felt I was lucky to have missed combat. Sybil was the old woman from Florida. I later learned she moved to Sky Gray when her husband shot himself. The young man left immediately, probably to get to work on time. Maria was the woman near my age, red hair, with an attractive but diffident visage. She was very small, almost tiny, and carried herself as if she wanted to be smaller. She was likely the most beautiful woman in any room. Philip gathered her right hand in both of his as if he thought she might bolt, whispered something to her, and walked with her to me. I thought for a second, yes, she was shaking, just a bit. "Maria Gray, this is John Buck," Philip said. She looked at me with her head canted down slightly, perhaps wanting to lower her eyes to the floor. "Hello, John." "Maria, my pleasure," I said, and I held my left hand out to her. She looked at my bandaged hand, and then hesitantly reached her left to mine, and we shook. It was a big moment for her, and Philip knew it, foresaw it, and arranged it. He held her right hand tightly during the introduction, not letting her get away. Father nodded and found someone else to speak with, so he left us alone and we talked for a few minutes. She spoke very meekly at first, forcing her eyes to mine with an almost visible willpower. She worked weekdays 7:30 to 3:30 cleaning rooms at a motel, so this early mass was not inconvenient. I asked her if she attended every week, and she said she had only been once before, last week. Father had asked her to return, saying he had someone he wanted her to meet. It took me a second to realize he'd had this in the works for a week. I looked at him. "I thought you dog you. She's beautiful and damaged, and you wanted us to meet." Phil, the priest and social manipulator. A new respect for old Catholic priests was planted at that moment. "Would you like to have dinner with me tonight? After your work?" I asked. She looked confused at that, but then she raised her eyes to mine and said, determinedly, firmly, as if it took a great effort or some moral courage, very, very quietly, "Yes, I'd like that. Shall we meet someplace? Or could you pick me up? I don't have a car myself." "I'll pick you up. May I have your address? I'll come about 7. "Good. I'll be ready." She was scribbling her address on a piece of paper she'd pulled from her purse. "I must go now. Thanks so much for asking me. See you at 7? Count on it." Father Phil and I walked back to the rectory together then. "What do you know about Maria?" I asked him. She said she hasn't been coming to Friday Mass much. "Oh, but her family are longtime parishioners. As a matter of fact, her family first settled Sky Gray. Her father works for the power company and her mother runs a daycare center for grade school kids. Good people. Maria was terribly hurt as a young woman, and she has trouble meeting people and bonding. I believe she sees a therapist." "What does that mean? How hurt?" "When she was 21 or so, she was attacked by some young men who violated her. She became very hesitant about men after that. Mentally, it has been a struggle to get her to join society. It's a very good sign that she started working, now coming to Mass, and did I hear you arrange a date?" I nodded. He said, "Very good." "Yes, very good."